The Star Wars movies brought audiences to many strange worlds, all of which had their own distinct environments and cultures. On some planets, human colonists made up the majority of the population, while on others, indigenous sentient species thrived. From the Sand People and Jawas of Tatooine to the Ewoks of Endor, the more alien indigenous species of certain prominent worlds have always been one of the most fascinating parts of Star Wars. Their societies were at once alien yet familiar, and they all had their own unique strengths and weaknesses. In this video, we're going to be comparing some of the more prominent indigenous species from the films and seeing how they stacked up against each other.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
First things first, let's clarify what species we're going to be talking about here. By and large, we're looking at species with distinct cultures from the galactic norm, which is to say that they weren't human, near human, or had cultures that were intertwined with greater galactic culture, as in the case of, say, the Duros and the Hutts. A whole lot of Star Wars species fall into that category, so for the sake of simplicity, we're going to be talking about 7 from the films. The Sand People and Jawas of Tatooine, the Gungans of Naboo, the Geonosians of Geonosis, the Wookiees of Kashyyyk, the Wampas of Hoth, and the Ewoks of the Forest Moon of Endor. Each of these species were wildly different from each other. The Gungans and the Wookiees had advanced societies with many unique kinds of technologies, as to a lesser extent did the Geonosians. The Ewoks, Sand People, and Wampas were all low-tech, but still much smarter than they were often made out to be. The Jawas were somewhere in the middle. With the exception of the Sand People and Jawas, who shared common ancestors, each of these species were biologically distinct from each other. The Tatooinian species were rodent-like, while the Ewoks and Wookiees were much closer to humans, looking a bit like apes. Wampas looked vaguely similar to Wookiees, but were actually reptomammals, not ape-like creatures. They were also considerably less intelligent by the other species on our list, though they weren't nearly as dumb as people think, as their inclusion here should indicate. The Gungans were amphibians with vaguely humanoid features, while the Geonosians were insectoid. Before we start comparing these 7 species, we need to establish the conditions of this comparison. Strength, of course, is completely subjective, able to mean anything from the raw physical strength of a species' members to the destructive capability of the species as a whole. We're going to go with something closer to the latter definition of strength here, with our metric being more or less along the lines of how screwed you'd be if you ended up on each species' bad side. We do have one caveat here though. We'll be disregarding technological advancement. Instead, we'll focus on physical capabilities and societal strengths and weaknesses. Now that all that's out of the way, let's start our analysis with the species we've talked about a whole lot, the Sand People. Feared and reviled by Tatooine's human settlers, the Sand People spent millennia making waves of colonists regret having dared to desecrate the Dune Sea. Their physical capabilities were about on par with those of humans, but it was their culture that really made them formidable foes. The Sand People were some of the toughest beings in the galaxy, living harsh lives out in Tatooine's unforgiving desert wastes. They were experts in using the environment to their advantage, and they followed unforgiving warrior codes. The Sand People never forgot a blood feud, and they would show little mercy to their enemies. They operated in scattered tribes which were highly cooperative, especially in battle. The Jawas, the Sand People's planetary neighbors, were a different story. They spent much of their history getting abused by the Sand People, often ending up enslaved or worse. They too operated in tribes, but they lived vastly different lives from the Sand People. The Jawas were scavengers, and they relied on cunning and stolen technology to stay alive. The Jawas were also skilled traders, well versed in the art of deception. They weren't nearly as physically imposing or bloodthirsty as the Sand People. In fact, they usually preferred to avoid combat. However, underestimating the Jawas was never a good idea, as their sneakiness and cunning could make them formidable opponents. You might have been surprised when you heard us mention the Wampas earlier. Hoth's largest natives are usually thought of as animals, not sentient beings. That's only true to an extent, however. Wampas were semi-sentient and actually lived in somewhat complex societies, if small ones. Wampas operated in extended families which served as hunting packs or highly primitive tribal units. These packs resided in large ice caves where they preserved the bodies of their prey for eating at later points. Physically speaking, Wampus were incredibly tough, and they were skilled ambush hunters capable of sneaking up on all but the most alert of prey. Ewoks are often described as mere comic relief, fuzzy little teddy bears that George Lucas slipped into the Return of the Jedi to sell toys. The people who say this must have missed the part of the film where those fuzzy little teddy bears massacred the 501st Legion and used the helmets of its stormtroopers as musical instruments after feasting on the bodies off screen. The Ewoks were no pushovers. Though cautious and wary of larger creatures, they were remarkably tough, physically speaking, and determined. In battle, they were vicious and effective masters of guerrilla warfare. Alone, an Ewok wasn't all that tough, but Ewoks were never alone. Their villages were intensely communal societies, and they always fought together. When a village of Ewoks went to war, not even the might of the Empire could withstand their tenacity. The Gungans were a rather versatile species able to survive and thrive both on land and underwater. Like the Ewoks, they often get brushed off as comic relief, but like with the Ewoks, the Gungans were actually capable warriors. Physically, they were much more agile and flexible than any human. Their society was organized around city-states which pulled their warriors together to form the Gungan Grand Army. This army fought in many wars, leaving the Gungans with plenty of strategic expertise. Their military tactics were perhaps the most advanced of any of the species we're discussing today. For the Geonosians, war was a way of life. These bloodthirsty insectoids were weaponsmiths and warriors known to satiate their lust for combat in gladiatorial arenas or inter-hive wars. Geonosians were remarkably tough, physically speaking, thanks to their hard exoskeletons, and they were also extremely agile and, in the case of warriors, capable of flight. Like with Ewoks, individual Geonosians didn't amount to much, but the Geonosians never fought alone. The Geonosians were a hive-minded species, and they employed horde tactics against their enemies, directed by queens who didn't care how many of their warriors died to win battles. The Geonosians were numerous, relentless, and, as many clone troopers learned, fairly difficult to kill. Lastly, we have the Wookiees. The Wookiees were essentially like Ewoks on steroids. Physically speaking, they were among the strongest species in the galaxy, able to rip the arms off their opponents with ease. Long centuries of hardship shaped the Wookiees into some of the toughest warriors the galaxy had ever seen, and they alone among the species we're talking about were politically united, led by a king that ruled from Wookroro. The Wookiees were different from some of the other warrior species we've talked about in one key way, however. They were much more individualistic. To Wookiee warriors, personal glory was a priority, and Wookiee armies rarely bothered with complex tactics for this reason, instead sending warriors out to fight as they saw fit. So how do these species rank up against each other? Let's start at the bottom of the list. The weakest of these indigenous species was easily the Jawas. Though clever, the Jawas just weren't all that tough. They preferred to avoid fighting, and for good reason. Just above them rank the Wampus, which might surprise some of you. Unlike the Jawas, the Wampus were incredibly tough, but what hurts them in the rankings was their lack of societal cohesion. They were solitary hunters, and even though they were strong and skilled hunters, individual opponents are never as much of a threat as a whole army. Above the Wampus rank the Gungans. The Gungans were nimble and tactically skilled, but they lacked the determination and aggression of the higher ranking species, and they weren't all that physically impressive. Next come the Sand People, who, though much less sophisticated than the Gungans, were much fiercer. The Sand People were feared for a reason, and when they were in their element on Tatooine, they were nigh invincible unless you're an angry teenage Jedi. However, the Sand People's rather small social groups and their unimpressive physical attributes hurt them in the rankings a bit. The number 3 spot on our list, believe it or not, goes to the Ewoks. These teddy bears may not have looked like much, but anyone who can wipe out the 501st Legions and feast on their corpses is tough in our book. Individually, Ewoks were surprisingly tough, and on a societal level, they had excellent organization and coordination. Second place goes to the Wookiees, who, as aforementioned, had nearly all the advantages of the Ewoks but with better physical attributes. They miss out on first place, however, for one key reason. their individualistic approach to combat. Individual Wookiee warriors were tough as nails, but they rarely fought as coherent armies, and historically, this was a massive weakness for them, leading to their subjugation on several occasions. Of the 7 species we've surveyed, the strongest of all were the Geonosians. Not only were the Geonosians heavily underrated on an individual physical level, but their hive mind and horde tactics made them absolutely terrifying to fight. A Geonosian army was a storm of cruel spears, chitinous hides, and leathery wings, pulsing with berserker-like, single-minded determination. The Geonosians were the masters of war, pain, and death, and for that reason, we're giving them the top spot. So that's our look at the strongest and weakest of some of Star Wars' most prominent indigenous species. But what do you think? Would you like to see longer videos on any of these species? Or would you like to see a part 2 of some legend species? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.